The Leadership Exchange podcast, a conversation with Christopher Pietroni, Professor of Leadership Practice and Director of the Birmingham Leadership Institute, and Professor Carolyn Wilkins OBE, Professional Fellow at the Birmingham Leadership Institute.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Leadership Exchange podcast with me, your host, Christopher Pietroni. This podcast is brought to you by the University of Birmingham, where I'm Professor of Leadership Practice and Director of the Birmingham Leadership Institute. In this podcast, we ask whether we have the right kind of leadership for the challenges that we face, or whether perhaps we need to exchange the approaches to leadership that we have around us for something new. In today's episode, I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Carolyn Wilkins OBE, who has had a fascinating combination of roles across the public sector, as we'll see, and who most recently, before joining the Birmingham Leadership Institute, was a specialist advisor to number 10 Downing Street on health and care integration. Carolyn, welcome.
Hi, Christopher.
Now, Carolyn, one of the things, as I was saying, that I think is really distinctive about your leadership experience is that you have often held roles where you have had to cross boundaries of various kinds. So at one point, you were Chief Executive of Oldham Council, and at the same time had the equivalent role in the NHS commissioning group in Oldham. And I think most people would think that working across local government and the NHS would be hard enough. But at the same time, you had regional responsibilities across Greater Manchester as a whole for public health. And then, during the pandemic, alongside all of that, you took on a national role as a director in Test and Trace. So I just wanted to start by asking you, I think the question that anybody listening would want to ask, which was, what on earth possessed you to take all of that on?
So I suppose what possessed me throughout my career really is something needs doing. So that's stepping into the space. So the opportunity to bring health and care together more closely was absolutely something I could see the sense of, because you could see the consequences of it not happening, for personally, for family members, but also for community people, and that frustration of thinking you'd got agreement, and then things unravelling outside the meeting. So a lot of time and effort being spent on things that weren't translating into the impact that you were trying to work for. So when the opportunity came up to step into the joint role, so to be the Chief Executive Local Authority, but also to be the accountable officer at the Clinical Commissioning Group, I didn't do it lightly, but it seemed like a really good opportunity to fundamentally change things and to meet some of the ambition. And then obviously then COVID started occurring. So a lot of the work then became about that. So having had those relationships and having that integration already of the organisation just made so much possible actually in the response to COVID. And then I got the call about the Test and Trace role, and I said no several times because there was already a lot on, and I had a role in Greater Manchester as the civil resilience lead. So I was running both the population health kind of response across Greater Manchester, or connecting with the 10 directors of public health, but also with the chief officers from the 10 local authorities, and was part of the strategic command group for Greater Manchester. But our frustrations and anger really with what was happening nationally, you have a moment where you can just sit and just be angry and have a lot of opinions and a lot to say, or you can take the opportunity offered and step into the space and try and do something about it.
I'm just really curious about the motivation. You said something, it seems to be important to you that if there's a problem that you see and you think you can do something about it, that you should. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I remember somebody said to me quite early in my career, leadership is about, if you see a fire, you should run towards it and do something about it. But they also had a very clear line, but don't get burnt. So and I think there is that about that leadership moment when you're sort of, everybody's going, somebody should do something about that, somebody should, they should, and then you realise that perhaps they is me, maybe I should. So or take that opportunity. So I think it is a courage thing as well, because if you take a secondment opportunity, then there are questions about the role that you were doing, so what happens there. So you've also got to have conversations with the people you work with, because it changes the dynamic for them. This is not a solo act, any of this. Leadership's collective, isn't it?
How have you protected yourself from, because there is a downside to that sort of courage, right? It comes at personal cost, and how have you managed to sustain yourself through that?
So I think I've always had quite an alive sense of risk, so what's the worst that could happen here, personally and professionally, about what could go wrong, because literally sometimes people could die, or you're doing something where there isn't a great route. There might be the least unfair, but it's the least unfair. It's not a good option. So I think that ability to, you can't see every risk coming, can you? You clearly, that's what we've seen the last few years. You can't see everything coming, even when you think you've got a plan for it. But going through that kind of process about, well, what's the worst that could happen, and can I live with that? So, but equally, what's the counterfactual? If I don't do this, if this doesn't happen, then what's the consequences of that as well? And for, not that anybody would know that there was a consequence, but what would I carry because I'd chosen not to speak up or step forward? So, and I was really vocal, about protective equipment, clothing. There were times when we all felt like we were kind of drug runners. You'd get a call about a drop in a car park in a neighbouring borough at 3:00 on a Sunday afternoon, and could you get a van there to collect it so that you could get the equipment to care homes, so that they, staff that were receiving patients with COVID from hospitals had some degree of protection. So, a huge sense of personal responsibility for your own workforce and what you are asking people to do, and deep frustration about being ignored. Do you remember all the food parcels, the national distribution of just woefully inadequate food distribution, when we had local infrastructure, not perfect, needed developing, but we knew our communities in a significantly deeper way than any national government could hope to. And we were seen as a stakeholder to be managed rather than a valuable resource as part of the kind of response. So I was really critical. So having been that, you think, well, are you just the noisy person in the room, or actually have you got something to contribute?
It's really interesting, Karen, because it strikes me, there you are, you go from being the boss, right? And you've had, by that stage in your career, you had been the boss of every organisation you'd been in for over a decade, for a long, actually probably even more, 15 years or something, right? And there you are, you find yourself in test and trace, and you're not actually the boss anymore, right? You're hierarchically you're a director, but anyway, you're in this kind of new system. And it sounds from what you've just said that you're often giving quite unwelcome feedback, right? It's not going to work like that. Not going to happen like that. So there you are. You're not the boss. You don't have the same status and authority that you previously had. And now here you are trying to get people who you need to, effectively more hierarchically senior than you to change their minds. And that must have been quite a shift for you. And how did you handle that? How did you navigate your way through?
Yeah. So it was very different in terms of, I suppose, you didn't have the levers that you could pull. Although let's not pretend just because you're the most senior person in an organisation that everything happens just because you say so. It's not quite like that. But recognising that you're only part of the issue as well. So even if it didn't work for certain communities, that thing, what if it works for most of the country? So it might still be the policy. Well, is there something then that could be developed for those that it doesn't work for? Where's that kind of perspective? So, and trying to push for why are we doing this? What's the rationale for this? And sometimes the rationale is that's the political choice that's been made, and it's not for you to be told, we just need to make sure that this will happen. So you're trying to work through and how does it have the best impact then? What can we do with this? So I think there are a few things for me. I suppose I wasn't employed directly. I was on secondment, so that definitely gives you a degree of freedom, doesn't it? Because if you're unpopular, well, then you go back to the job that your substantive post. So I suppose that takes a degree of risk out of it. It doesn't de-risk it completely. But it's important that you have enough credibility in that room to be heard. That doesn't mean you always get your way. And so I was really clear, I think, even with the sector, that I couldn't promise to change everything. All I could promise was to do my damnedest, really, on behalf of the sector and the communities that we represent. And I did. I'm confident I did that, and that we got some wins. I think in the end, local government funding went up from about 400 million to 2.2 billion directly. The container outbreak management funding, which we then kind of oversaw the allocation of, the self-isolation payments, I'm not saying that was all down to me at all. It was, definitely part of a team effort, but being in those conversations and trying to sort of say, but this is how it is on the ground, and this is how things work in reality, and, this is what's possible. And there was a lot of, can local government do this? I believe local government pretty much do anything, but why should we, and how are we supported with resources and capacity to make it possible, so some of those sort of challenges and feedback.
One of the things that must have been an experience that you've had repeatedly over the years, and must have been in spades during COVID, is a sort of sense of uncertainty about what the right thing to do is, or where the information you're being given kind of is ambiguous and it's not clear. And how have you handled those moments when people are looking to you for leadership and you're uncertain and it's uncertain? How do you navigate that? So,
there's so many things, aren't there, that you just don't know the outcome. You make a decision in the moment, and actually, particularly if you're in an emergency planning scenario situation, and you're doing the decision log, the best practice is you also record why. What did you know on which to base the decision that you've taken, because you forget, because the events move on, and the decision you made at 1 o'clock and then events by 3 o'clock are totally different. Would you have made the same decision then, but at 1 o'clock this is what you knew, this was what was available to you? So there's some of that kind of discipline about that. There's also, what do other people think? What are other people's views? But that isn't abdicating the responsibility of them being the decision maker. So, even take an example on COVID, we knew that lockdown was coming, all of us locally, and that we were going to send staff home. But we also knew that we'd got essential services that needed to carry on. We also knew that we had quite a significant number of staff that were going to be clinically extremely vulnerable, so we're going to have to shield. So it wasn't just that they were working at home and could be redeployed. There were some people in essential services who were going to be sent home. And so what does that mean for the particularly, intimate personal care, social workers, domiciliary care workers, refuse collection, any number of kind of essential services. So we had to pause sending everybody home, even though everybody was desperately frightened. They were worried about their own families. They didn't want to be physically, in buildings. We had to hold the time to try and work out, who was available to us, who could do different jobs, what were the employment implications of all of that, and then but make those kind of calls. So huge pressure, and I don't know whether it was the perfect decision, but based on the information I had, the timing that when, and then trying to explain to people why you made the decision you have. Some people still really unhappy, angry, frightened about it, but you're trying to balance individuals and what's good for them, and treating people with respect against what the organisation needs, but also what's the organisation responsible for in terms of those wider communities. So I think that's all you can do. Your own values come into it as well about, can I live with that decision? And actually, if it's a decision I don't feel able to take, but it's needed, then I need not to be here and somebody else needs to come into this space and do it. So you have to reflect on that, I think, at key times, thinking, I really don't want to do this. But it needs doing. Can I find a way of doing it? And if not, then maybe I need to not be here and somebody else that because it's the thing that needs to be done.
In this podcast, we're really interested in whether we have the kind of leadership that we need to meet the challenges that we face. And it just sounds from that description like, do we see, is that the leadership that we see around us? Do you think that's the kind of leadership we need? And if so, have we got it?
So I see a lot of that leadership, but I don't necessarily see a lot of leaders of organisations behaving in that way. So well, or the narrative or the story or the presentation, because it's hard, isn't it, to divorce, to know what's really going on behind the scenes. So I think, I've worked with, honestly, some amazing people, but that have no profile, or, they're not doing it for that reason. They're just doing it. They're just, tackling really, really difficult issues, or even actually just, having fun and doing really interesting things in a kind of collective way, stepping into spaces and making things happen. I think our narrative of leadership, when I got I think it was was it Chief Exec at Rossendale, the headline in the local paper was Mum of Two, because that was my main qualification for getting the job. So there's definitely still a lot of that kind of narrative about and I remember somebody saying to me, you can't be a chief exec with long hair and you mustn't wear cardigans. And it's like, what? How does any of that impact on my ability to do the job? But that idea of, don't be emotional, or even things like, you're good at the soft stuff because you're softly spoken and you're not very tall or whatever. So those people's ideas of leadership that they're quite keen to sort of put on you, unfortunately, I see a lot of that. I don't think necessarily people are like that, but I think their presentation of leadership comes across in that kind of way.
So you've led in a series of crises, local, regional, national, including the pandemic, but you've talked about other emergencies in Greater Manchester and so on. If we just think about leading in crisis, what's your learning, having been there, about what makes effective leadership in a crisis?
So clarity, I think, is clarity is crucial. Making sure that you've got the right team around you, you've got the right resources, you've got the kind of right focus. Absolutely, if somebody's looking for an answer and you haven't got it, there is no space here for winging it at all. This isn't it. If you don't know, then you need to find out or find somebody that does know. I think being very aware of yourself. So somebody that worked in the RAF said to me once, stress is like alcohol. The more you've had, the less able you are to judge how much you've had. So you're in a crisis, you think you're okay, but it's day 4, and in local government we don't have the blue light rota in quite the same way, so we don't do the sort of shifts. So making sure that you are still functioning as you need to be able to function, because you don't just go home and switch off from these things. So making sure that you've got that kind of that focus, but you're also thinking about what's going to follow. So the decisions for the now, but what are the consequences of decisions in the to be as well, so that you're not just in the immediate, that you are taking time to do the reflection, as we would say, Christopher, to get up on the balcony. But absolutely so important to not just be in the heat of it all in the moment, and it can be very seductive to be there because there's so much going on, but that if you're not thinking about what's coming next. So when I was in Rossendale, there was a major gas explosion underneath an electricity pylon at the end of the M66. So we had, I can't remember now how many thousand, well, there was basically electricity out across a lot of the borough, but gas as well. And it was December. So we lost, the council lost all its electricity. So we couldn't, no lights, no heating, no IT, no phones, nothing. Couldn't get the barrier up to get the bin wagons out, so you had to dismantle that. And then, but that went on for days, because if you're putting the gas back on, the gas have to go in and flush out every property. 2 weeks before Christmas we came to, so this was a longer time, not just the day of the explosion and I think we got the electricity back on within sort of 24 hours. So it was making sure that you were planning for some of that, and that you could hand over. It's quite hard to do. I find it quite hard to do, to hand over, because you feel like you should be there. It should be you, but it can't be. So there has to be the team and the sort of the handover.
And what about younger people who might not think of themselves as leaders? What would you say to somebody who's at the early part of their career in public sector or in other sectors about how to go about exercising and developing their own leadership?
So a couple of things really. One, I'm not surprised they don't, because we frame the narrative very much as leaders of the future, which I hear as you're not a leader now. Get back in the box. So even framing it as that, future leader, just because you're young doesn't mean you're not a leader now. So there is something, I think, for us actually at institutional level or a course level about how we frame that kind of. So, you don't have to be older or more progressed in your career to be a leader. I mean, some people never exercise leadership, and yet they may work in an organisation for, it's not saying they don't do valuable work, but they're not necessarily practising leadership. So I think the really important thing about recognising that leadership happens in the small things as well as the really big things, and, connecting to your own values and your own passions and about the things that you just can't walk past that. I'm not prepared to walk past that or ignore that. I'm going to do something about that. That's leadership. So helping people, I think, recognise those leadership moments and the practice of leadership, and helping build in their confidence that can then apply to really big, and that thing about, if not you, who? Don't just assume there's somebody else that's going to come along and do that, because there very well might not be.
So one last question, Carolyn. Whose leadership inspires you?
So, I was really thinking about this and thinking, it's not that I don't think there's some amazing people, but it's really hard to know what's genuine, isn't there? So I would, if you were saying name somebody, I'd think, oh, well, Obama looked like he wore it lightly, like he did things because they really mattered and they were important to him, that he wasn't doing it just to be the president, not just, I'm going to do the leadership stuff because I want to be in a position. And so I was reflecting more about the kind of people that I've learned from, because you sit in rooms, don't you, think, I would never want to lead like that. I do not want to be that kind of leader. But you also see people who think, wow, the way you dealt with that, the way you were in that space, the way you held that, the way you made that happen, or you made that possible. I think that's where I've been kind of deeply impressed. I think the first leader of a local authority that I worked with in a senior position was at Bury Council, actually, and he's no longer with us, sadly, but he had deep values, and he was very gentle actually in the space, but people paid attention to him and they wanted to work with him. He was just really effective at kind of creating this sense of shared purpose, and that everybody's contribution was valuable. And I just thought that was so so different from what I'd seen, I think, to that point, but so kind of impressive. So and the other thing is, you might see somebody think that's really bad leadership, but you don't know what's gone on to get them to that point, and you don't know how bad it might have been. This might be very much the least bad option. So I try not to be too sort of judgmental, because you think, well, if I was walking in their shoes, where would I get that? But I think that deep consideration for others is an important part of it. I suppose I value leadership that chimes with the values that I hold as well, I suppose. And if somebody's working on things that feel important to me, that feels like good leadership. But effective leadership can also be working on things that I don't agree with, can't it? So it's an interesting one, I think.
Carolyn, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear your stories and your experiences of leadership, and to have leadership explored both in the sort of nuts and bolts and nitty gritty of how do we make stuff happen on the ground, from waste disposal to care to bins and all the rest of it, right into the heart of some of the most important issues that we're facing as a country, whether that's the pandemic or whether that's community cohesion or prosperity, or it's been absolutely thrilling. And to have leadership explored as curiosity, as compassion, as humility, as kindness, and then above all, I think that question that you've kept coming back to, which I think is a central leadership question, which is, if not me, who? So thank you very much. And to those listening and watching, thank you for joining us. If you've enjoyed the Leadership Exchange podcast, do please leave us a review and share with others. And if you'd like to hear about future episodes, don't forget to subscribe.
The University of Birmingham and Birmingham Leadership Institute logo. Tune in to the Leadership Exchange podcast, birmingham.ac.uk/leadership exchanged. Produced by Creative Media.